The campsite was untouched, yet it felt wrong, like a place abandoned mid-breath. Massive claw marks gouged the trees around it, and the lingering stench of blood hung in the air. Then came the deep, guttural sound from behind. It wasn't far, and it wasn't afraid. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's stories, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe to stay updated with future stories. Also, leave a comment letting me know which city in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into the first attack. Andrew Collins zipped up his weatherproof jacket, shielding himself from the crisp Montana morning air. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. He inhaled deeply, savoring the scent of pine and fresh water that permeated the air around Flathead Lake. Perfect day for fishing, he murmured to himself, a smile playing on his lips. As a high school biology teacher in Missoula, Andrew cherished these moments of solitude. The summer break had just begun, and he was eager to spend as much time as possible pursuing his favorite hobby. He had driven up to Flathead Lake the previous evening, camping overnight to get an early start. Andrew walked down to the shoreline where his small aluminum canoe was tethered. He began methodically loading his gear, a tackle box, cooler, first aid kit, and his prized fishing rod. Each item had its place, carefully arranged to maintain the canoe's balance. "Let's see what we can catch today," he said, patting his tackle box affectionately. As he worked, a park ranger's truck pulled up nearby. A woman in a khaki uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Good morning," she called out, approaching Andrew. "Heading out for some fishing?" Andrew straightened up, offering a friendly wave. "Morning, Ranger. That's the plan. Hopefully the fish are biting today." The ranger nodded, her eyes scanning the lake. "Should be good conditions. Just make sure you've got your permit, and remember to keep an eye out for any wildlife." "Always do," Andrew replied, pulling out his fishing permit for her to check. "Seen any bears around lately?" The ranger shook her head as she verified his permit. "No recent sightings near the lake, but you know how it is. They're out there, so stay alert." "You fishing alone today?" Andrew nodded. "Yeah, just me. Needed some quiet time after a long school year." "I hear that." The ranger chuckled. "Well, enjoy your day, Mr. Collins. Stay safe out there." As the ranger walked back to her truck, Andrew finished loading his canoe. He double-checked his supplies, ensuring he had enough water and snacks for the day. Safety was always a priority, especially when fishing alone. With a grunt of effort, Andrew pushed his canoe into the water. The cool liquid lapped at his waterproof boots as he steadied the craft. Carefully, he climbed in, settling onto the wooden seat with practiced ease. He picked up his paddle and began to propel himself away from the shore. The first few strokes were always Andrew's favorite part of any canoe trip. The transition from land to water, the gentle rocking of the canoe, the quiet splash of the paddle. It all combined to create a sense of freedom and possibility that never failed to exhilarate him. As he paddled further out onto Flathead Lake, Andrew marveled at the beauty surrounding him. The water stretched out like a vast mirror, perfectly reflecting the sky and the forested shoreline. In the distance, he could see the peaks of the Mission Mountains, their snow-capped tops gleaming in the early morning sun. "This is what it's all about," Andrew said to himself, taking a moment to simply drift and absorb the scenery. After about 20 minutes of steady paddling, Andrew found himself in a promising spot. He could see a few fish jumping in the distance, and the depth seemed right for the species he was after. He carefully set down his paddle and reached for his fishing rod. With practiced motions, Andrew baited his hook and prepared to cast. He stood up slowly in the canoe, mindful of his balance. With a fluid motion, he cast his line, watching with satisfaction as it arced through the air before landing with a soft plop about 30 feet away. "And now we wait," he murmured, slowly reeling in the slack. As the morning wore on, Andrew lost himself in the rhythm of casting, reeling and occasionally adjusting his position. He caught a few smaller fish, admiring each one briefly before releasing them back into the lake. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth offsetting the cool breeze coming off the water. Around midday, Andrew decided to take a break. He reeled in his line and set his rod down in the canoe. Reaching into his cooler, he pulled out a sandwich and a bottle of water. As he ate, he let the canoe drift lazily, enjoying the peacefulness of his surroundings. I should do this more often, he thought, watching an osprey dive into the water some distance away, emerging with a fish in its talons. After finishing his lunch, Andrew checked his watch. He still had several hours of good fishing time left before he needed to head back. He picked up his paddle and began to move towards a new spot he wanted to try. As he paddled, Andrew's mind wandered to the upcoming school year. He was considering taking his biology students on a field trip to Flathead Lake to study the local ecosystem. Lost in thought, he didn't immediately notice that he had drifted further from the shore than he had intended. When he finally looked up, Andrew was surprised to see how far out he was. The shoreline looked smaller than usual, and he realized he had unknowingly paddled into a less familiar part of the lake. "Whoops," he muttered. "Better pay more attention." He was about to turn the canoe around when a movement in the water caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a large fish, but something about the size and shape seemed off. Andrew squinted, trying to get a better look. A chill ran down his spine as he realized what he was seeing. A dark shape was moving through the water, too large to be a fish, too smooth to be a log. It was heading in his direction. "No way," Andrew whispered, his heart beginning to race. "It can't be." But as the shape drew closer, there was no denying it. A bear's snout broke the surface of the water, followed by its head. Its small ears were pinned back and its eyes were fixed directly on Andrew's canoe. Andrew's mind raced, recalling everything he knew about bear encounters. But all his knowledge seemed to evaporate in the face of this unexpected situation. He had never heard of a bear swimming so far out in the lake, much less approaching a boat. With trembling hands, Andrew grabbed his paddle. He needed to get away to put as much distance between himself and the bear as possible. But as he began to paddle, he realized with growing horror that the bear was swimming faster than he could move the canoe. The peaceful day had suddenly turned into a nightmare. As the bear closed the distance, Andrew Collins, the experienced outdoorsman and biology teacher, felt a primal fear grip his heart. In that moment, he knew that his life was about to change forever, and the calm waters of Flathead Lake were about to become the stage for a terrifying struggle for survival. Andrew's arms burned as he paddled frantically, his eyes darting between his destination, the distant shoreline, and the approaching bear. The splash that had first caught his attention now seemed deafening, each stroke of the bear's powerful limbs bringing it closer to his small canoe. "This can't be happening," Andrew muttered through gritted teeth, his voice tight with fear. He tried to recall everything he knew about black bears, but his panicked mind couldn't focus. Were they good swimmers? How fast could they go? He had always thought of bears as land animals, not aquatic predators. The bear's dark eyes remained locked on Andrew's canoe as it swam, its snout barely breaking the surface of the water. It moved with surprising grace and speed, cutting through the lake with ease. Andrew realized with growing horror that it was gaining on him rapidly. "Hey!" he shouted, hoping to scare the animal away. "Get back! Go on! Get out of here!" His shouts echoed across the water, but the bear showed no sign of being deterred. If anything, it seemed to swim faster, as if accepting Andrew's cries as a challenge. Andrew's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. Should he try to outmaneuver the bear? Head for the nearest shore? Or should he stay put and try to intimidate it? None of the options seemed good, and time was running out. He glanced around wildly, looking for anything that might help. His fishing rod lay at his feet, but he doubted it would be much use against a bear. The tackle box was within reach, but what good would fishing lures do? For a moment, he considered grabbing his phone to call for help, but he quickly dismissed the idea. Even if he could get a signal out here, help would never arrive in time. The bear was now less than 20 feet away, close enough for Andrew to see water streaming from its fur as its head rose higher above the surface. Its powerful front paws churned the water, propelling it forward with terrifying speed. "Oh God," Andrew whispered, his voice trembling. He could see the bear's eyes clearly now, dark and focused. There was no malice in them, no evil intent, just a primal instinctive drive that Andrew couldn't begin to understand. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. Andrew could hear his own ragged breathing, feel the sweat beating on his forehead despite the cool air. The gentle lapping of water against the canoe, once soothing, now sounded like a countdown to disaster. Suddenly, the bear let out a loud snort, spraying water from its nostrils. The sound jolted Andrew back to reality, and he realized he had stopped paddling. He gripped the paddle tightly, his knuckles white, and began to move again with renewed desperation. Come on, he urged himself, each stroke feeling weaker than the last. His arms ached, and he could feel blisters forming on his palms. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was survival. The bear was almost upon him now, close enough for Andrew to smell its wet fur. He could see its muscles rippling beneath its sleek coat as it swam, a testament to the raw power contained in its body. Please, Andrew found himself saying, though he wasn't sure who or what he was pleading with. Please, just leave me alone. As if in response, the bear let out a low growl that sent shivers down Andrew's spine. It was a sound that spoke to something primordial in him, awakening ancient fears buried deep in his DNA. Then, without warning, a massive paw broke the surface of the water, slamming into the side of the canoe with tremendous force. The impact nearly capsized the small craft, sending Andrew sprawling to one side. Water sloshed over the gunwale, soaking his legs and the bottom of the canoe. No! Andrew yelled, struggling to regain his balance. He gripped the sides of the canoe, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The canoe rocked violently, teetering on the edge of flipping over. For a moment, Andrew was certain he was going to end up in the water with the bear. He could already imagine those powerful jaws closing around him, dragging him under. But somehow, miraculously, the canoe steadied. Andrew found himself face to face with the bear, mere inches separating them. He could see every detail of its face, the wet fur plastered to its head, the whiskers quivering with each breath, the sharp teeth barely visible behind its lips. The bear's eyes, so alien yet somehow intelligent, bored into him. Easy, Andrew said softly, his voice shaking. Easy there, big guy. You don't want to do this. Just swim away, okay? Please. The bear tilted its head slightly as if considering Andrew's words. For a brief, hopeful moment, Andrew thought it might actually listen, might turn and swim away. But then its eyes narrowed, and it let out another low growl. Andrew knew he had to act. With trembling hands, he reached for his paddle, never taking his eyes off the bear. He gripped it tightly, ready to use it as a weapon if necessary. It wasn't much, but it was all he had, all. I don't want to hurt you, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. But I will if I have to. Just leave me alone and we can both go our separate ways. Okay? The bear's response was another swipe at the canoe, its claws screeching against the aluminum hull. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, multiplied 100-fold. Andrew winced, his ears ringing. He swung the paddle at the bear's head more out of reflex than any planned strategy. The plastic blade connected with a dull thud, but the bear barely seemed to notice. If anything, the blow seemed to anger it further. With a roar that seemed to shake the very air, the bear reared up in the water, its front paws rising above the side of the canoe. Andrew had a split second to appreciate the sheer size and power of the animal before those paws came crashing down. The canoe didn't stand a chance. It flipped over instantly, dumping Andrew unceremoniously into the cold water of Flathead Lake. He plunged beneath the surface, disoriented and panicked. Underwater, everything was muffled and blue. Andrew could see the dark shape of the bear above him, its paws churning the water into a froth. Bubbles streamed from his mouth as he fought the urge to gasp. With burning lungs, Andrew kicked hard, propelling himself away from the bear and towards the surface. He broke through with a desperate gasp, sucking in air like a drowning man, which he realized with a jolt of fear he might soon become if he couldn't get away from the bear. As he treaded water, trying to get his bearings, Andrew came face to face with his worst nightmare. The bear was right there, its snout mere inches from his face. He could feel its hot breath on his skin, see the water dripping from its bared teeth. In that moment, as he stared into the eyes of the wild animal, Andrew Collins knew that his life would never be the same. The peaceful day of fishing he had planned had turned into a desperate fight for survival, and it was far from over. With his canoe overturned and no immediate means of escape, Andrew realized that his ordeal was only just beginning. Andrew's heart pounded in his chest as he treaded water, face to face with the bear. The animal's dark eyes seemed to bore into him, filled with a primal intensity that made Andrew's blood run cold despite the lake's chilly temperature. For a moment that felt like an eternity, neither moved. Andrew could hear his own ragged breathing, the gentle lapping of water against the overturned canoe, and the deep, rumbling breaths of the bear. The peaceful sounds of the forest that had surrounded him earlier were gone, replaced by this terrifying tableau. "Easy," Andrew whispered, his voice barely audible. "Easy there, big guy." The bear's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, but it made no other move. Andrew's mind raced, trying to recall everything he knew about bear encounters. Make yourself look big, make noise, back away slowly, but none of that applied here in the water. He was completely out of his element, and the bear had every advantage. Suddenly, the bear lunged forward, its massive paws slashed through the water, aiming directly for Andrew's face. With a desperate cry, Andrew threw himself backwards, submerging himself just in time to avoid the blow. He could feel the rush of water above him as the bear's paw passed where his head had been moments before. Underwater, Andrew kicked hard, trying to put some distance between himself and the bear. His clothes dragged at him, weighing him down, but adrenaline gave him strength. He surfaced several feet away, gasping for air. The bear was already turning towards him, its powerful body cutting through the water with ease. Andrew looked around frantically, searching for something, anything that could help him. His eyes fell on the overturned canoe, floating nearby. Without thinking, Andrew lunged for the canoe. His fingers scraped against the aluminum hull, searching for purchase. He managed to grab onto the edge, pulling himself half out of the water. The sound of the bear's approach spurred him on. Andrew could hear it snorting and splashing as it swam towards him. With a surge of desperate strength, he hauled himself onto the bottom of the overturned canoe. No sooner had he gotten his balance than the bear reached the canoe. Its claws screeched against the aluminum hull, the sound sending shivers down Andrew's spine. The canoe rocked violently as the bear tried to climb onto it. "No!" Andrew yelled, his voice cracking with fear. He scrambled to keep his balance, knowing that falling back into the water now would be a death sentence. Frantically, Andrew looked around for a weapon. His paddle was floating a few feet away, but he didn't dare reach for it. Instead, his hand closed around his tackle box, which had somehow stayed with the canoe when it flipped. Without thinking, Andrew swung the tackle box at the bear's head. The plastic container connected with a dull thud, spraying water and sending lures flying. The bear let out a surprised grunt, shaking its head. For a moment, Andrew felt a surge of hope. Maybe he could drive the bear away, make it decide he wasn't worth the trouble, but his hope was short-lived. With a roar that seemed to shake the very air, the bear renewed its attack. Its powerful paws slammed into the canoe, rocking it violently. Andrew lost his balance, tumbling backwards. He managed to grab the edge of the canoe, half in and half out of the water. The bear's massive head loomed over him, water streaming from its fur. Andrew could see every detail: the texture of its wet nose, the gleam of its teeth, the intensity in its eyes. Time seemed to slow down as the bear opened its mouth. Andrew knew he should move, should try to get away, but he was frozen in terror. He watched, as if from outside his own body, as the bear's jaws descended towards his outstretched hand. Pain exploded through Andrew's hand as the bear's teeth sank into his flesh. He screamed, the sound tearing from his throat. The bear shook its head, and Andrew felt himself being pulled into the water. Panic overwhelmed him. Andrew thrashed wildly, kicking and punching with his free hand. His lungs burned as he was dragged under, water filling his nose and mouth. Underwater, everything was a confused blur of bubbles and dark shapes. Andrew could feel the bear's teeth still clamped around his hand, could feel himself being pulled deeper. His chest ached for air, his mind clouding. With the last of his strength, Andrew kicked out, aiming for where he thought the bear's body should be. By some miracle, his foot connected with something solid. He felt the bear's grip on his hand loosen. Seizing the opportunity, Andrew yanked his hand free. Pain lanced up his arm, but he ignored it, kicking hard for the surface. His head broke through and he gasped, sucking in great lungfuls of air. But he wasn't safe yet. Andrew could see the bear surfacing nearby, shaking its head and snorting water from its nose. It turned towards him, its eyes finding him once more. "No," Andrew gasped, his injured hand cradled against his chest. "Please, no more." He tried to swim away, but his injured hand made it difficult. Every movement sent waves of pain through his arm. The bear was approaching again, its powerful strokes eating up the distance between them. Andrew's foot brushed against something solid, and he realized with a jolt that he had reached the lake bed. He was closer to shore than he had realized. Hope surged through him, giving him renewed energy. Stumbling, half swimming and half walking, Andrew made for the shore. He could hear the bear behind him, its splashes growing louder as it gained on him. His ankle twisted painfully on a submerged rock, but he pushed through the pain, driven by sheer survival instinct. The water grew shallower, and Andrew found himself able to stand, though unsteadily. He stumbled forward each step in agony as the rocky lake bottom cut into his feet through his waterlogged shoes. He could feel the bear's presence behind him, could almost feel its hot breath on his neck. It spurred him on, terror giving him strength he didn't know he possessed. Andrew's world narrowed to a single focus: reach the shore, get out of the water, survive. As he staggered onto the pebbly beach, Andrew risked a glance over his shoulder. The bear was right there, water streaming from its fur as it emerged from the lake. Its eyes were fixed on him, filled with a determination that made Andrew's blood run cold. Andrew knew the chase wasn't over. He was out of the water, but he was far from safe. His hand throbbed, his ankle screamed with every step, and he was exhausted beyond belief. But the bear was still coming, and Andrew knew that his fight for survival was far from over. With a final burst of energy, Andrew lurched towards the tree line, praying he could find somewhere to hide, somewhere to escape the relentless pursuit of the bear. As he stumbled into the forest, the sounds of the bear's heavy breathing and the crunch of pebbles under its paws followed him, a terrifying reminder that his ordeal was far from over. Andrew Collins stumbled through the underbrush, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest that had seemed so peaceful this morning now felt like a green maze of terror. Behind him, he could hear the bear crashing through the vegetation, its heavy breathing a constant reminder of the danger at his heels. Pain lanced through Andrew's hand with every movement. He glanced down at it, wincing at the sight of torn flesh and blood. The bear's teeth had left deep puncture wounds, and the hand was already swelling. He cradled it against his chest, trying to protect it as he ran. "Keep going," Andrew muttered to himself, his voice hoarse. "Just keep going." He pushed through a dense thicket, branches scratching at his face and arms. The pain in his ankle flared with each step, threatening to send him tumbling to the forest floor. But fear kept him upright, kept him moving forward. Suddenly, the ground beneath Andrew's feet gave way. He found himself sliding down a steep embankment, leaves and dirt flying around him. He tumbled head over heels, unable to stop his descent. With a splash, he landed in a shallow creek at the bottom of the ravine. The shock of the cold water momentarily cleared Andrew's panic-clouded mind. He struggled to his feet, gasping and sputtering. The creek was only knee-deep, its clear water now muddied by his fall. For a moment, all was quiet except for the gentle burble of the creek and Andrew's labored breathing. Then he heard it, the sound of the bear making its way down the embankment. "No, no, no," Andrew whispered. "Oh." Andrew, his eyes darting around frantically for an escape route. The creek curved around a bend just ahead. Without thinking, Andrew began to wade through the water, hoping against hope that he could lose the bear around the bend. As he rounded the curve, Andrew's heart sank. The creek ended in a small waterfall, dropping off into a deeper pool below. He was trapped. The sound of splashing behind him made Andrew whirl around. The bear had reached the creek and was now standing at the water's edge, its dark eyes fixed on him. Water dripped from its fur, and its chest heaved with exertion. Andrew backed up slowly, his feet slipping on the smooth stones of the creek bed. His mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. But there was nowhere to go. The bear had him cornered. "Okay," Andrew said, his voice shaking. He raised his uninjured hand slowly, palm out. "Okay, big guy, let's just calm down here. Neither of us wants this to go any further, right?" The bear tilted its head slightly as if considering Andrew's words. For a brief, hopeful moment, Andrew thought it might actually turn and leave. But then it let out a low growl and took a step forward into the creek. Andrew's back hit the edge of the waterfall. He could feel the spray on his neck, hear the rush of water below. The bear was only a few yards away now, its massive paws sending ripples through the creek as it advanced. Time seemed to slow down. Andrew could see every detail of the bear, the way its wet fur clung to its powerful frame, the gleam of its teeth as it opened its mouth, the intensity in its eyes as it prepared to lunge. In that moment, survival instinct took over. As the bear reared up, preparing to strike, Andrew did the only thing he could think of. He jumped. The world spun around him as he plummeted over the edge of the waterfall. For a heart-stopping moment, he was in free fall, the roar of the water filling his ears. Then he hit the pool below with a tremendous splash. The impact drove the air from Andrew's lungs. He flailed wildly, disoriented and desperate for air. His injured hand screamed in agony as he tried to swim, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might drown. But survival instinct kicked in once again. Andrew kicked hard, propelling himself towards the surface. He broke through with a gasp, sucking in great lungfuls of air. As he treaded water, trying to get his bearings, Andrew heard a splash behind him. His heart sank as he realized the bear had followed him over the waterfall. "Come on!" Andrew shouted in frustration and fear. He began to swim towards the shore, his movements clumsy and painful. The bear was a strong swimmer, cutting through the water with powerful strokes. Andrew could hear it getting closer, could almost feel its hot breath on his neck. Just as Andrew's feet touched the bottom of the pool, he felt something grab his leg. Pain exploded through his calf as the bear's teeth sank into his flesh. Andrew screamed, a sound of pure agony and terror. He thrashed wildly, trying to break free. But the bear's grip was like iron, dragging him back into deeper water. Panic overwhelmed Andrew. He was being pulled under, the bear's weight threatening to submerge him. Water filled his nose and mouth as he gasped and spluttered. In desperation, Andrew lashed out with his good leg. By some miracle, his foot connected with the bear's snout. He felt a moment of resistance, then suddenly he was free. Not wasting a second, Andrew scrambled towards the shore. He half swam, half dragged himself onto the rocky bank, gasping and coughing. But he couldn't stop. Despite the searing pain in his leg, Andrew forced himself to his feet. He stumbled forward, leaving a trail of blood on the rocks behind him. The sound of the bear emerging from the water spurred Andrew on. He limped into the forest, each step in agony. His vision blurred with pain and exhaustion, but he kept moving, driven by the primal need to survive. As he staggered through the trees, Andrew's mind raced. He knew he couldn't keep running forever. He was injured, exhausted, and losing blood. The bear would catch up to him eventually. Then, through the haze of pain and fear, Andrew spotted something that made his heart leap. A large fallen tree, its roots creating a small cavern where it had been uprooted. With the last of his strength, Andrew dove for the shelter of the fallen tree. He crawled into the space beneath the roots, making himself as small as possible. From his hiding place, Andrew could see the bear's paws as it approached. He held his breath, praying that the animal wouldn't detect him. The bear snuffled around the fallen tree, its claws scraping against the bark. Andrew could hear its heavy breathing, could smell its wet fur. He closed his eyes, every muscle in his body tense. For what seemed like an eternity, the bear investigated the area. Andrew's lungs burned as he held his breath, afraid that even the slightest sound would give him away. Then, miraculously, the bear moved on. Andrew heard its heavy footsteps receding, the sound of breaking branches growing fainter as it lumbered away. Even after the sounds had faded completely, Andrew remained frozen in his hiding place. His body shook with exhaustion and residual fear. The pain from his injuries, dulled by adrenaline during the chase, now returned in full force. And as the reality of his situation sank in, Andrew felt tears spring to his eyes. He was alive, but he was far from safe. He was injured, lost in the wilderness, with no supplies and no way to call for help. As shock began to set in, Andrew curled up in his makeshift shelter, cradling his injured hand and leg. The struggle for survival was far from over. But for now, all he could do was rest and hope that help would come before the bear returned. The forest had grown quiet, save for the distant rush of water and the occasional bird call. Andrew Collins lay curled beneath the fallen tree, his body trembling from cold, pain, and residual fear. He didn't know how long he had been there, drifting in and out of consciousness, but the changing light filtering through the roots told him that several hours had passed. Finally, the silence convinced Andrew that the bear had truly gone. With agonizing slowness, he began to uncurl his stiff limbs. Every movement sent waves of pain through his body, reminding him of the ordeal he had endured. "Okay, Andrew," he muttered to himself, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "You've got to move. You can't stay here forever." Gritting his teeth, Andrew began to crawl out from under the fallen tree. His injured hand throbbed mercilessly as he used it to brace himself, leaving smears of dried blood on the bark. As he emerged into the open, the full extent of his injuries became apparent in the fading daylight. His clothes were torn and soaked, clinging to his body. The hand that the bear had bitten was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the puncture wounds angry and red. His calf, where the bear had grabbed him in the water, was a mess of torn flesh and congealed blood. And his ankle, twisted during his frantic escape, was puffy and discolored. Andrew took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He needed to assess his situation, to make a plan. But it was hard to think past the pain and exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "Think, damn it," he urged himself. What's the first step? Survival training from years ago flickered through his mind. Find shelter, find water, signal for help. He had shelter, of a sort, in the fallen tree, but he needed to get back to the lake. That's where people would look for him, where he might find help. With a groan of effort, Andrew pulled himself to his feet. The world spun alarmingly, and he had to lean against a nearby tree to keep from falling. Once the dizziness passed, he took a tentative step forward. Pain shot up his leg from his injured ankle and calf, nearly buckling his knee. Andrew bit back a cry, breathing heavily through clenched teeth. "One step at a time," he whispered. Just one step at a time. Slowly, agonizingly, Andrew began to make his way through the forest. He had no idea which direction the lake was in, but he figured if he kept going downhill, he'd eventually reach water. Every step was a struggle, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through his battered body. As he stumbled forward, leaning heavily on trees for support, Andrew's mind wandered. He thought of his students back in Missoula, of the biology lessons he had planned for the coming year. Would he ever see his classroom again? Would search parties find him, or would he become just another statistic, another story of wilderness tragedy? The sound of running water pulled Andrew from his dark thoughts. Hope surged through him as he realized he was nearing the creek he had fallen into earlier. If he could follow it downstream, it would lead him back to the lake. With renewed determination, Andrew pushed on. The creek came into view, its clear water glinting in the last rays of sunlight. Andrew practically fell to its banks, cupping water in his good hand to drink greedily. The cool liquid soothed his parched throat, clearing his head slightly. As he rested by the creek, something caught Andrew's eye, a flash of color against the brown and green of the forest floor. He blinked, focusing on the object, and felt a surge of hope. It was his tackle box, washed downstream after his encounter with the bear. Andrew crawled to the battered plastic container, his fingers fumbling with the latch. Inside, most of the contents were a jumbled, waterlogged mess. But there, tucked in a corner, was a small first aid kit, and next to it, miraculously dry in its waterproof case, was his phone. Hands shaking, Andrew pulled out the phone. The screen lit up as he pressed the power button, showing a faint signal. 1 bar. It wasn't much, but it was something. With trembling fingers, Andrew dialed 911. He held his breath as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, a click. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. Help, Andrew croaked, his voice breaking. Bear attack. Flathead Lake, I'm hurt. Sir, can you tell me your exact location? The dispatcher asked. Andrew looked around helplessly. I don't know. I was fishing on the lake. A bear attacked my canoe. I'm in the woods now by a creek. I can't walk very well. Okay, sir, stay calm. We're triangulating your position now. Can you tell me your name? Andrew Collins. I'm a teacher from Missoula. Please, you have to help me. The bear, it might come back. We're sending help right now, Mr. Collins. I need you to stay where you are and keep this line open. Can you do that for me? Andrew nodded, then realized the dispatcher couldn't see him. Yes, I can do that. Good. Now tell me about your injuries. How badly are you hurt? As Andrew began to describe his wounds, he felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. The adrenaline that had kept him going was fading, leaving him weak and shaky. He slumped against a tree, the phone clutched tightly in his hand. Mr. Collins, are you still there? The dispatcher's voice sounded distant. Yeah, Andrew mumbled. I'm here. Just tired. I know you're tired, Mr. Collins, but I need you to stay awake. Help is on the way. Can you tell me what you see around you? Andrew forced his eyes open, trying to focus on his surroundings. Trees, lots of trees, the creek, it's getting dark. That's good, Mr. Collins, you're doing great. Now I need you to do something for me. Can you make some noise? Shout or whistle if you can. It'll help the rescue team find you. Andrew took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in his ribs. Then, summoning what little strength he had left, he called out, "Help! I'm here! Help!" His voice echoed through the trees, startling a flock of birds into flight. Andrew called out again and again, each shout leaving him more exhausted than the last. As the light faded from the sky, Andrew's calls grew weaker. The dispatcher's voice became a lifeline, urging him to stay awake, to keep making noise. But it was getting harder to focus, harder to keep his eyes open. In the distance, Andrew thought he heard something. A faint sound, almost drowned out by the rushing of the creek. Was it his imagination, or was that a voice calling back? I think, Andrew mumbled into the phone. I think I hear something. That's the rescue team, Mr. Collins, the dispatcher said encouragingly. They're almost there. Just hold on a little longer. Andrew tried to call out again, but his voice was barely a whisper now. The world was growing fuzzy around the edges, darkness creeping in at the corners of his vision. As consciousness began to slip away, Andrew had one last coherent thought. He had made it. He had survived the bear attack, had found his way back, had held on long enough for help to arrive. The last thing Andrew heard before the darkness took him was the sound of voices and rustling underbrush, growing louder by the second. Then, mercifully, everything faded to black. Andrew Collins slowly regained consciousness, the sterile smell of a hospital room filling his nostrils. His eyelids felt heavy as he struggled to open them, the fluorescent lights above momentarily blinding him. As his vision cleared, he became aware of the steady beeping of monitors and the soft hum of medical equipment. "Welcome back, Mr. Collins," a gentle voice said from his right. Andrew turned his head to see a nurse adjusting his IV drip. "You've been through quite an ordeal." Andrew tried to speak, but his throat was dry and raw. The nurse quickly offered him a cup of water with a straw, helping him take small sips. Where am I?" Andrew finally managed to croak out. "You're in Kalispell Regional Medical Center," the nurse replied. "You were brought in 2 days ago. Do you remember what happened?" The memories came flooding back. The peaceful fishing trip, the sudden appearance of the bear, the terrifying chase through the forest. Andrew's heart rate spiked, causing the monitor beside his bed to beep more rapidly. "Easy now," the nurse soothed, placing a calming hand on his arm. "You're safe here. The doctor will be in soon to check on you and explain your injuries." As if on cue, a middle-aged man in a white coat entered the room, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Collins, I'm Dr. Patel. I'm glad to see you're awake. How are you feeling?" Andrew took a moment to assess his condition. His entire body ached, but the sharp, intense pain he remembered from the forest had dulled to a more manageable level. "I've been better," he replied with a weak attempt at a smile. "But I guess I'm lucky to be alive." Dr. Patel nodded gravely. "Indeed you are. You suffered some serious injuries. The bear's bite on your hand caused significant tissue damage, but we've managed to repair most of it. You'll need physical therapy, but we expect you to regain full use of your hand over time." Andrew glanced down at his heavily bandaged hand, flexing his fingers slightly and wincing at the pain. The doctor continued, "Your calf required quite a few stitches, and you have a severe sprain in your ankle. You also have numerous cuts and bruises, and you were suffering from hypothermia when you were brought in. But considering what you went through, you're in remarkably good shape. When can I go home?" Andrew asked, already feeling restless despite his weakened state. Dr. Patel smiled sympathetically. "Not for a few days at least. We need to monitor you for infection and ensure you're strong enough to move around on your own. In the meantime, there are some people here who'd like to talk to you about what happened." As if on cue, 2 men entered the room. One wore the uniform of a park ranger, while the other was dressed in plain clothes but had an air of authority about him. "Mr. Collins," the ranger began, "I'm Ranger Mike Thompson from Flathead Lake State Park. This is Detective John Reeves from the local police department. If you're feeling up to it, we'd like to ask you a few questions about your encounter with the bear." Andrew nodded, steeling himself to relive the terrifying experience. Over the next hour, he recounted every detail he could remember, from the bear's initial appearance in the lake to his desperate flight through the forest. The ranger and detective listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly letting Andrew tell his story uninterrupted. When he finished, Ranger Thompson leaned forward in his chair. "Mr. Collins, I want you to know that what you experienced is extremely rare. Black bears don't typically behave this aggressively, especially in water. We're taking this incident very seriously." Detective Reeves nodded in agreement. "We've organized search parties to try and locate the bear. Given its unusual behavior, it's possible the animal is sick or injured, which could explain its aggression. Have you found my canoe?" Andrew asked, suddenly remembering the overturned boat. Ranger Thompson shook his head. "Not yet, I'm afraid. The lake's quite large, and the current could have carried it quite a distance. We're still searching, though." As the men prepared to leave, Andrew called out, "Wait, my tackle box. I found it by the creek. Did anyone bring it in with me?" The detective and ranger exchanged glances. "I'm sorry, Mr. Collins," Detective Reeves said gently. "When the rescue team found you, there was no tackle box. You were barely conscious, clutching your phone. Are you sure you didn't imagine finding it?" Andrew's brow furrowed in confusion. He was certain he had found the tackle box, had used the first aid kit inside, but now doubt began to creep in. Had it all been a hallucination brought on by pain and exhaustion? After the officials left, Andrew lay back in his hospital bed, his mind whirling. The bear attack itself was vivid in his memory, but the details of his time in the forest seemed to blur together. How much of what he remembered was real, and how much was a product of his traumatized mind? Days passed, and Andrew's physical condition improved steadily. His hand remained heavily bandaged, and he needed crutches to move around due to his injured leg, but he was growing stronger. However, the psychological impact of his ordeal weighed heavily on him. One afternoon, as Andrew was flipping through channels on the small hospital TV, a breaking news alert caught his attention. The local news anchor's voice filled the room. In a surprising turn of events, the bear responsible for the attack on a Missoula teacher at Flathead Lake last week has reportedly been spotted near the lake shore. Eyewitnesses describe seeing a large black bear emerging from the water, carrying what appeared to be a mangled metal object. Local authorities are urging residents and visitors to exercise extreme caution. Andrew's heart raced as he listened to the report. The mangled metal object. Could it be his canoe? The image of the bear emerging from the lake with his ruined boat sent a shiver down his spine. It was as if the animal was taunting him, reminding him that their encounter was far from over. As the days wore on, Andrew's story began to spread. Local newspapers ran articles about the Flathead Lake bear attack, and a few reporters even tried to get interviews with him at the hospital. Andrew declined them all, not ready to relive his experience for public consumption. On the day of his discharge, Andrew stood at the hospital room window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. His body was healing, but he knew the mental scars would take much longer to fade. The forest, once a place of solace and adventure for him, now loomed in his mind as a realm of hidden dangers. As he turned to gather his belongings, Andrew caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at him looked older, more weathered. His eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there before, but beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was also a glimmer of something else. Resilience, perhaps, or a newfound respect for the raw power of nature. Andrew knew that his life had been irrevocably changed by his encounter with the bear. But as he prepared to leave the hospital and face the world again, he made a silent promise to himself. He would not let fear define him. He would heal, he would recover, and someday he would return to the wilderness, older, wiser, and with a profound understanding of what it truly meant to survive. As the hospital doors slid open, Andrew Collins stepped out into the warm Montana afternoon. The sunlight felt alien on his skin after days under fluorescent lights. He squinted, adjusting to the brightness, his good hand gripping the handle of his crutches tightly. "You ready for this?" asked Sarah, his girlfriend who had driven up from Missoula to take him home. Andrew nodded, trying to muster a smile. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess." They made their way to Sarah's car, Andrew's progress slow and awkward on the crutches. Every step sent a dull ache through his injured leg, a constant reminder of his ordeal. As Sarah helped him into the passenger seat, he caught sight of his reflection in the side mirror. The face looking back at him seemed older, more lined, with dark circles under wary eyes. "Hey," Sarah said softly, noticing his frown. "One step at a time, remember? We'll get through this together." Andrew managed a weak smile. "Yeah, you're right. Let's go home." As they pulled out of the hospital parking lot, Andrew's mind wandered back to the bear, to the lake, to the terrifying chase through the forest. The doctors had warned him about potential PTSD and recommended he see a therapist. But how could he explain the fear, the primal terror of being hunted? The drive back to Missoula was long and mostly silent. Sarah tried to make conversation, updating him on messages from concerned colleagues and students. But Andrew's responses were brief and distracted. His eyes kept darting to the tree line along the highway, half expecting to see a dark shape emerge from the woods. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Sarah's voice cut through Andrew's reverie. "We should stop for the night. There's a motel coming up in a few miles. What do you think?" Andrew nodded, realizing how exhausted he felt. "Yeah, that's probably a good idea." They pulled into a small roadside motel, its neon vacancy sign flickering in the twilight. Sarah went to check in while Andrew waited in the car, his eyes scanning the darkening parking lot nervously. Once in their room, Andrew sank onto the bed with a groan of relief. The day's journey, short as it was, had taken more out of him than he'd expected. Sarah busied herself unpacking a few essentials and setting up Andrew's medications on the bedside table. "You should try to get some rest," she said, sitting beside him on the bed. "We've got another long day of driving tomorrow." Andrew nodded. But as he lay back on the unfamiliar bed, he knew sleep would not come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bear's face, felt the terror of being dragged underwater. Hours ticked by. Sarah's soft breathing beside him told Andrew she had fallen asleep, but he remained wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The room felt too small, too confining. He needed air. Carefully, so as not to wake Sarah, Andrew eased himself out of bed. He grabbed his crutches and made his way to the door, wincing at every creak of the floorboards. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp. Andrew hobbled to a bench near the motel's small garden area and lowered himself onto it with a sigh. The sky above was clear, stars twinkling brightly away from the city lights. As he sat there, the events of the past week replayed in his mind. The peaceful morning on the lake, the sudden appearance of the bear, the desperate struggle for survival. It all seemed so surreal now, like a nightmare he couldn't quite shake off. A twig snapped in the darkness, and Andrew's heart leapt into his throat. His eyes darted around, searching for the source of the sound. A small rabbit hopped out from behind a bush, and Andrew let out a shaky laugh, realizing how on edge he still was. "Can't sleep?" Andrew started at the voice, turning to see an older man approaching. The stranger was dressed in flannel and jeans, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked, gesturing to the bench. Andrew hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Go ahead." The old man sat down with a grunt. "Name's Bill. Saw you come in earlier. Looked like you've been through the ringer." "You could say that," Andrew replied, unconsciously rubbing his bandaged hand. Had an accident while fishing. Bill nodded sagely. Nature can be unforgiving sometimes. Been there myself a time or two. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sound the chirping of crickets and the occasional passing car on the highway. You know, Bill said eventually, whatever happened out there, it doesn't define you. It's what you do next that matters. Andrew turned to look at the old man, surprised by the insight. How did you? Bill chuckled. Son, I've seen that look before. In the mirror even. Takes one to know one, I suppose. He stood up, stretching. Well, I'd best be getting back to bed. You should too, young man. Rest is the best medicine, or so they say. As Bill walked away, Andrew called out, Hey, Bill! The old man turned. Thanks, Andrew said simply. Bill tipped an imaginary hat and disappeared into the darkness. Andrew sat for a while longer, pondering Bill's words. Eventually, the chill of the night air drove him back inside. As he carefully maneuvered back into bed, Sarah stirred. Everything okay? She mumbled sleepily. Yeah, Andrew whispered, surprised to find he meant it. Everything's okay. The next morning, they hit the road early. As they drove, Andrew found himself opening up more, sharing details of his ordeal that he'd kept bottled up. Sarah listened attentively, offering support and understanding. As they neared Missoula, the familiar landscape brought a mix of emotions for Andrew. Relief at being close to home, anxiety about facing concerned friends and colleagues, uncertainty about what came next. You know, Sarah said as they passed the Welcome to Missoula sign. You don't have to go back to work right away. Take some time, heal up properly. Andrew nodded, grateful for her understanding. I think I will, but I also think I need to go back to the lake someday. Face it, you know? Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand gently. When you're ready, I'll be right there with you. As they pulled up to Andrew's apartment, he took a deep breath. The journey back had been long, not just in miles, but in the mental and emotional distance he'd traveled. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time since the attack, he felt a glimmer of hope. Stepping out of the car, leaning on his crutches, Andrew looked up at the sky. The same sun that had shone over Flathead Lake during his ordeal now warmed his face here in Missoula. He was home, he was alive, and he was ready to begin the next chapter of his journey. 2 weeks after returning home, Andrew Collins found himself in the office of Ranger Mike Thompson at Flathead Lake State Park. The small room was cluttered with maps, wildlife guides, and various outdoor equipment. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his crutches leaning against the desk. Ranger Thompson shuffled through some papers before looking up at Andrew. Mr. Collins, I want to thank you for coming back out here. I know it can't be easy. Andrew nodded, his eyes darting to the window where he could see a sliver of the lake. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. Ranger, I need to know if there's been any progress. The ranger sighed, leaning back in his chair. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Collins. We've found no concrete evidence of the bear you described. We've combed the area where you were found, set up trail cameras, even brought in tracking dogs. Nothing. Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. But that's impossible. You saw my injuries. You know what happened to me. I'm not saying I don't believe you, Thompson said quickly. Your injuries were certainly consistent with a bear attack, but... He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. But what? Andrew pressed. But black bears don't typically behave the way you described. Swimming out into deep water, pursuing a canoe, the relentless chase through the forest. It's highly unusual behavior. Andrew clenched his fist, ignoring the twinge of pain from his still healing hand. Are you saying you think I'm lying? No, not at all, Thompson assured him. We're just puzzled. We haven't found your canoe either, which is strange. A metal canoe should have washed up somewhere by now. Andrew slumped in his chair, feeling a mix of frustration and despair. He knew what had happened to him, but without evidence, would anyone truly believe his story? As if reading his thoughts, Ranger Thompson leaned forward. Look, Mr. Collins, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I've seen things in these woods that would surprise most people. Just because we can't explain something doesn't mean it didn't happen. Andrew appreciated the ranger's words, but they did little to assuage his growing sense of isolation. As he left the ranger station, he couldn't shake the feeling that his ordeal was slowly being transformed from a harrowing reality into an unbelievable tale. The next day, Andrew found himself at Missoula General Hospital for a follow-up appointment. Dr. Patel examined his healing wounds, making notes on his clipboard. "Well, Mr. Collins, your physical recovery is progressing nicely," Dr. Patel said, setting down the clipboard. "How are you feeling otherwise? Any nightmares, anxiety?" Andrew hesitated before answering. I'm struggling, Doc. Not just with the memories, but people don't seem to believe what happened to me." Dr. Patel's expression softened. "That must be very frustrating. Have you considered speaking to a therapist? Traumatic experiences can be difficult to process, especially when you feel unsupported." "I've thought about it," Andrew admitted, "but I'm afraid they'll just think I'm crazy too." "Mr. Collins," Dr. Patel said firmly, "what you experienced was real. Your injuries are real. Don't let anyone make you doubt your own lived experience." Andrew nodded, grateful for the doctor's understanding. As he left the hospital, he felt a renewed determination to share his story, to make people understand the danger that lurked in the wilderness. That evening, Andrew sat at his computer, staring at a blank document. He had decided to write about his experience for a local fishing magazine, hoping to warn others about the potential dangers on Flathead Lake. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he struggled to find the right words. How could he convey the terror of those moments? The primal fear of being hunted, the desperation of fighting for survival. Finally, he began to type. "I never thought a peaceful fishing trip could turn into a fight for my life. But on that sunny morning on Flathead Lake, I came face to face with nature's raw power and unpredictability." Andrew wrote late into the night, pouring his experience onto the page. When he finally finished, he read through the article, reliving each terrifying moment. It was all there: the initial shock of seeing the bear in the water, the frantic escape through the forest, the long wait for rescue. He attached a photo of his scarred hand as evidence of his encounter. With a deep breath, he hit send, submitting the article to the magazine. Whether they published it or not, Andrew felt a sense of catharsis in sharing his story. Weeks passed. Andrew's physical wounds continued to heal, but the emotional scars lingered. He returned to teaching, but found himself hesitating whenever his students asked about his injuries or his time off. One sunny afternoon, as the school year was winding down, Andrew stood at the edge of the faculty parking lot, keys in hand. He had made a decision. Sarah pulled up in her car, a worried expression on her face. "Are you sure about this, Andrew? You don't have to prove anything to anyone." Andrew took a deep breath, looking at the tackle box and fishing rod in the back of his car. "I'm sure. I need to do this, Sarah. For myself." With a nod of understanding, Sarah helped him load the last of his gear. "Just promise me you'll be careful, and call me the moment you get there." "I promise," Andrew said, giving her a quick kiss before getting into his car. As he drove towards Flathead Lake, Andrew felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The familiar landscape brought back flashes of memory: the glint of sunlight on water, the sound of splashing, the bear's dark eyes. Finally, he arrived at the lake. The water stretched out before him, calm and inviting, betraying no hint of the danger he knew lurked beneath its surface. Andrew's hand shook slightly as he reached for his tackle box, but he steeled himself and began to set up his gear. An hour later, Andrew sat in a rented canoe, his fishing line cast into the water. Every ripple, every splash made him tense, but he forced himself to remain calm. He was facing his fears, reclaiming the peace he had once found in this place. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Andrew realized something. The terror of his encounter would always be a part of him, a reminder of nature's power and his own resilience. But it didn't have to define him. He reeled in his line and began to paddle back to shore. As he did, he caught movement out of the corner of his eye. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought he saw a dark shape moving through the water. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there but the reflection of the fading light on the lake's surface. Andrew let out a shaky laugh, realizing how on edge he still was. But as he reached the shore and pulled his canoe up onto the beach, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had faced his fears and come out the other side. As he packed up his gear, Andrew's phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from the fishing magazine. They wanted to publish his story. A smile spread across Andrew's face as he read the email. His tale would be shared, a warning to others about the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. And while some might doubt the details, might question the reality of his experience, Andrew knew the truth. He looked out over the lake one last time before getting into his car. The scars on his hand tingled, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. But as he started the engine and began the drive home, Andrew felt a sense of peace settle over him. His story might be unbelievable to some, but it was his truth. And in facing that truth and returning to the lake and casting his line once more, Andrew had taken the first steps towards truly healing. The bear might still roam these woods, but it no longer haunted his every waking moment. He had survived, he had persevered, and he had reclaimed his life. And that, Andrew realized, was the most important truth of all.